Darya Village was the kind of place that even maps seemed to ignore. If you spread an entire district map across a table, tracing your finger along the worn creases, your fingertip might pass right over the spot where it should have been, but you still wouldn't notice it. The village existed, yes, but in the plainest, most unremarkable sense of the word. It wasn't famous for its beauty, nor cursed by some ancient tragedy, nor even blessed with anything remotely interesting. It was simply there. People rarely spoke of it, and when they did, it was like they were recalling a dream they weren't quite sure they'd had. Darya Village sat quietly between a dry riverbed and a long dirt road that pretended it still led to the city. The village had no distinct smell, no unique sound, no special landmark that might make a traveler stop and say, "Oh yes, I remember this place." Instead, travelers rarely stopped at all. They just passed through, this rising behind their carts or motorcycles, never once pausing to wonder what lay behind the cluster of houses, or the lonely store in the center. The houses were the same pale brown as the earth beneath them, so the whole village often looked as if it had been molded directly from the soil like soft clay that had dried too long under the sun. Roofs sagged a little, doors leaned slightly inward, and windows were always half open, half broken, or half forgotten. The villagers themselves matched their surroundings perfectly. They were simple people, not by choice, but by habit. No one hurried. No one raised their voice. No one argued or celebrated loudly. Life moved in a quiet, steady pattern, like a clock whose tick had softened over the years until no one bothered to listen to it anymore. And right in the middle of this dull landscape stood a small, nameless store. It was the only store in the village, but no one ever bothered giving it a name. It felt like the store didn't deserve one, or maybe it just never asked for one. The signboard above the door had long ago lost its paint, and the wooden board beneath had split into two thin, fading planks barely held together by rusted nails. Most days, the village felt like a memory left behind by someone who had forgotten they even had memories. There, you see, nothing ever happened in Darya Village. There were no festivals worth remembering, no gatherings worth retelling, no events worth discussing. When night fell, the village didn't glow or sparkle. It simply dimmed like a candle about to die. Crickets chirped faintly, but even their sounds seemed lazy, as if they too were bored with the place. Children didn't run wild. Elders didn't share dramatic stories from their youth. Even the dogs barely barked. The village was quiet not because it had to be, but because it was content being so. The only thing that ever broke the silence, though not very effectively, was the dull shuffle of old sandals on dirt when villagers made their way to the nameless store. This store stood at the center of the village like a tired guardian that had long given up on keeping watch. Its door hung slightly crooked, always half open, never fully closed, as if the hinges no longer had the patience for movement. Inside, the shelves carried just enough supplies to keep the village alive. Some stale biscuits, loose tea leaves, salt, half-used bottles of oil, a few rusted tools, and occasional vegetables. There were items so old that no one even remembered when they arrived. Everything inside felt slow. The air itself seemed tired. The storekeeper, Himmat Ali, matched his environment perfectly. He never rushed. He never smiled too widely, nor frowned too deeply. His face always held the same expression, a distant stare, as though he were listening to a sound no one else could hear. Some villagers joked that he and the store were made from the same wood. Others said the store looked older than the village itself, but no one ever checked, and no one cared enough to ask. It was just a fact of life, like the sun rising or the dust settling. Darya Village was stuck in a loop, not a magical one, not a cursed one, just a very, very boring one. Every morning looked exactly like the last, with the same dust drifting across the floor of the store, the same sunlight sneaking through cracks in the roof, and the same quiet footsteps approaching the entrance. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the dry riverbed, it carried with it a silence so deep, so thick, that it felt like the world had forgotten about this village entirely. And perhaps, in some way, it truly had. But the villagers didn't complain. Why would they? To complain, you must first notice that something is wrong. In Darya village, nothing was ever different enough to be called wrong. Everything was just the way it had always been: quiet, slow, uneventful, and easily forgotten. It's easy to dismiss a place like Darya as a backdrop, a footnote, the kind of setting you define in a story just before the real adventure begins somewhere else. You might think, what's the point? What is the point of a place where the biggest event of the day is someone buying a handful of tea leaves? Where the most dramatic sound is the squeak of an old door hinge? But isn't there something strangely beautiful about that kind of existence? In a world that screams for our attention, a world of constant noise, notifications, and an endless race to be seen and heard, Darya village is an island of stillness. It's a place that doesn't demand anything from you. It doesn't ask you to be more, do more, or achieve more. It simply is. Imagine living in a place where time isn't a currency you're always running out of, where your worth isn't measured by your productivity or your social media followers. The people of Darya village weren't sad or unfulfilled. They just lived a different kind of life. A life measured in seasons, not seconds. A life where community wasn't about grand gestures, but about the unspoken understanding that came with sharing the same quiet space day in and day out. Think about Hamad Ali, the storekeeper. In our world, he might be seen as stagnant, unambitious. But in Darya, he was a pillar. He was the quiet center of their universe. His store wasn't just a place to buy goods. It was a checkpoint in everyone's day. The slow, deliberate way he'd measure out salt or wrap a biscuit wasn't an efficiency. It was a ritual. It was a moment of connection in a world that had forgotten how to connect without a screen. The namelessness of the store is also telling. Why give something a name when everyone knows what it is? It was the store. That's all it needed to be. In a way, it's the ultimate form of belonging. It has so integrated into the fabric of the village that it doesn't need a separate identity. It is like an old friend you've known for so long you just call them by a simple, familiar nickname. This village, this story, it's a powerful reminder. A reminder that not all value is loud. Not all beauty is vibrant. Sometimes, the most profound things in life are found in the quiet spaces. And the things we overlook, the gentle rhythm of a day, the comfort of the familiar, the peace that comes from not needing to be anything other than what you are. And that feeling, that sense of deep, quiet contentment, that's not boring. That's a treasure. It's a kind of peace many of us spend our entire lives searching for. We look for it in promotions, in new cities, in grand adventures. But maybe, just maybe, it's been there all along, hiding in the Darya villages of our own lives, the quiet moments, the familiar routines, the simple connections we often take for granted. And yet, the story leaves us with a tiny thread of anticipation. It says that tucked somewhere beneath all this dullness, something small, something fragile, something almost invisible, waited not to be discovered, not to be celebrated, just to be noticed by anyone, even once. What could that be? A hidden talent? A secret kindness? A dream that refused to die even in the driest of soils? Maybe it's not a thing at all. Maybe it's just the potential for change. The idea that even in the most static, unchanging place, a single act of noticing can set something new in motion. A single person stopping, really looking, and seeing the value in the quiet could be the spark that finally gives the candle a reason to burn brighter. And that, I think, is a beautiful thought. It tells us that no person and no place is ever truly forgotten. There's always something waiting to be noticed. We just have to be willing to slow down, look closer, and listen to the silence. The store stood silently, as it always had, like a fixture in the village that had grown from the earth itself. Its walls were made of dry, sun-baked wood, rough to the touch, and lined with shells that had sagged under years of uneven weight. There was no sign above the door, only the faint outline where one might once have existed. Rusted nails stuck out like forgotten teeth, and the paint had peeled away decades ago, leaving the wood gray and sun-bleached. Inside, the air was warm and thick with dust. It carried the faint scent of old paper, stale tea, and the subtle tang of rusted metal from tools left on the shelves. Sunlight slipped through the cracks in the roof in thin, lazy lines, illuminating the motes of dust that floated like tiny ghosts. Everything moved slowly, even the air, as if the store itself were unwilling to rush. Himmat Ali, the store's keeper, sat behind the counter. He was a thin man with sharp, tired features, though his expression had long since softened into a distant, patient neutrality. He did not smile often, nor did he frown. He simply existed in the rhythm of the store, shifting slightly from side to side, brushing off a speck of dust here, straightening a packet of biscuits there, all in almost imperceptible movements. Time inside the store had its own pace, slower than the world outside, slower even than Darya Village itself. One could spend hours wandering between the shelves and feel as if nothing at all had happened. The items on the shelves were unremarkable: a few jars of oil, a tin of loose tea leaves, some salt, stale biscuits, broken tools, and vegetables that seemed to wilt only in a slow, measured way. Everything had been here for years, yet nothing had changed. The store's visitors arrived at predictable intervals. First came Shehzada Khan, who bought a cigarette and complained quietly that it tasted old. He entered with a soft shuffle of worn sandals, glanced at the shelves, muttered about freshness, paid an exact change, and left without ceremony. Then came Amma Babi, selecting a packet of salt, to vegetables, and some tea, counting her coins carefully as always, speaking barely above a whisper. Finally, Ali Murad appeared, often buying nothing at all, lingering a few minutes in the silence, tracing his fingers along a shelf or tapping the counter idly before leaving. Each visit, brief and predictable, barely disturbed the store's stillness. The rhythm of the day depended on these brief intrusions, and yet the store, like its keeper, remained unbothered. Himmat's ledger sat on the counter, open to a fresh page. Its paper was yellowed and worn, the ink faded but legible. Each day, he recorded the same details, like a ritual meant to mark time that had little relevance. Morning, Shehzada Khan, 1 cigarette. Afternoon, Amma Babi, salt, tea, vegetables. Evening, Ali Murad, no purchase. Sometimes he paused, pen hovering over the page, tempted to write something more. A thought of change would flicker briefly in his mind, then vanish like the wind outside. He would sigh, scratch out the line, and continue. Nothing unusual ever happened here. There was one shelf in particular that seemed almost alive. Not literally, of course, but Himmat sometimes imagined it noticing him, waiting for his touch, adjusting itself slightly each day. He would straighten a jar of tea, and the shelf would settle differently the next morning, as if remembering his movements. The villagers never saw this. They could not see it, and even Himmat rarely admitted it aloud. Yet there was something comforting in this small, quiet routine, as though the store itself had learned to live in the same slow, patient rhythm as Darya Village. The door of the store creaked and groaned whenever it moved. It never fully opened, never fully closed, leaning slightly to one side as though too tired to stand straight. Sometimes the creak sounded like a sigh, long and slow, almost human, almost sentient. Himmat ignored it, though occasionally he would pause and listen. The village had taught him that small things, shifts of dust, the creak of a door, a faint vibration along a shelf carried no significance. And yet, today, for the first time in many years, he noticed the sigh differently. It seemed to stretch longer, almost like a soft warning. But no one else was here to hear it. No one ever was. Perhaps that was why the store had never needed a name. A name suggested attention, importance, and expectations. It implied that change might come. And in Darya Village, change was neither necessary nor welcome. The store existed without it. Its purpose was not in recognition or distinction, but in quiet presence, enduring like the village itself, slow, steady, almost invisible, yet always there. And so it remained, waiting, existing, unremarkable, yet quietly observing, patient as the dust in its corners, patient as the sunlight through its roof, patient as time itself. Because in a village that nobody remembered, the nameless store was the only place that truly kept track of the passing days. And that, in Darya Village, was more than enough. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing for more. Himmat Ali had lived in Darya Village for so long that no one remembered when he first arrived. Some whispered he had always been there, a permanent fixture like the dusty wind or the leaning roofs. Others claimed he came decades ago, walking down the old dirt road with a single bag, and an expression as unreadable as the sky before a storm. Himmat never confirmed either story. He rarely spoke at all. His voice existed, but it was thin, dry, and steady, used only when absolutely necessary, as if he believed words were a resource that could run out if wasted. Every sentence he spoke was short and practical. Salt is on the second shelf. Price hasn't changed. No fresh vegetables today. Come tomorrow. He never asked questions, never gave long answers, and never laughed. The villagers had simply accepted him as a man who moved through life like a whisper, soft, brief, and almost invisible. His morning routine never changed. Every day, without fail, Himmat opened his store at the exact moment the first sliver of sunlight touched the edge of the dry riverbed. He didn't own a clock or check the sky. He just knew. He would unlock the rusty padlock, pull the stubborn door halfway open, and let the tired sunlight fall across the dusty floorboards. Then came the ritual. He dusted the counter, adjusted the jars on the shelves, swept the floor, and flipped open his ledger to a new page. These acts weren't just habits, they were anchors. Small motions that kept him steady in a life where all days blurred into one. Despite his predictable routine, something about Himmat remained a mystery. He was not old, but not young, not lively, but not tired, not friendly, but not unfriendly. He simply existed, just as the store simply existed. People often wondered about him. But in Darya Village, curiosity was a delicate plant too weak to grow in such quiet soil. Still, the villagers carried silent questions. Why does Himmat never leave the village? No one could recall a single time he'd walk past the second well at the edge of the settlement. Why does he keep the store open even on days when no one buys anything? The store earned barely enough to sustain itself. And where do his supplies come from? No trucks came to restock, yet the jars were always just full enough, never overflowing, but never empty. Most strangely, why does he sometimes stare at the shelves, as if listening to something no one else can hear? Himmat never offered answers, and no one dared to ask. One quiet afternoon, as sunlight slanted across the counter, Himmat wrote his usual entries in his ledger. Morning, Shahzada Khan, cigarette. Afternoon, Amababi, tea. He paused before writing the third line. For the first time in years, Ali Murad had not come. The space where his name should have been seemed strangely empty, like a missing piece in a long-established pattern. Himmat tapped his pen against the ledger. A soft, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. Instead of writing, he simply closed the ledger early. He sat still, staring at the shelf, the one that seemed to shift slightly at night. Something felt off. There was no fear, no urgency, just a tiny ripple in the stillness, like a single drop of water disturbing a perfectly calm pond. He exhaled slowly. The door creaked, a longer sound this time, almost as if it were calling him. Just as Himmat lifted his head, a voice came from the doorway. You look troubled. It was unusual. People in Darya rarely made observations. He turned. It was Maryam, a quiet young woman who only visited the store for flour or oil. She stood at the doorway, half in sunlight, half in shadow, her expression unreadable. I'm not troubled, Himmat replied, his voice even. Just thinking. What about? She asked, stepping inside. The floorboards groaned softly beneath her feet. He hesitated. He wasn't used to explaining himself. The day feels different, he finally said. Maryam looked around the store, as if searching for something out of place. Everything was the same: dusty shelves, crooked door, sagging roof, yet she nodded slowly. I felt it too, she whispered. Himat's eyebrows lifted by a fraction of movement equivalent to a gasp for anyone else. You did. Yes, she said. The wind was strange this afternoon, too quiet, even for Daria. She paused, then added, It feels like the village is waiting for something. The words hung in the air, heavy and out of place. Waiting for what? Neither of them knew, but something had shifted. Not visibly, not loudly, just enough to be felt by the people who had never before shared more than a simple greeting. For the first time in perhaps decades, Himat Ali lifted his gaze fully, meeting someone's eyes not with his usual distant stare, but with the faintest hint of recognition. Miriam's presence didn't change anything physically. The shelves didn't shake, the door didn't slam, the sunlight didn't flicker. But deep inside Himat Ali, behind the quiet rituals and the worn routines, a tiny thread loosened. Not broken, not removed, just loosened. And in Darya village, even such a small shift could mean everything. Because in a place where nothing ever happened, this was the first sign that something finally might. The morning wind in Darya village was always predictable. It was soft, lazy, and carried the faint taste of dust from the dry riverbed. It never rushed, never startled. It just drifted through the village like an old friend who'd forgotten why he visited but kept coming back anyway. But this morning, something was different. The wind arrived late. Not by much, not enough for most people to even notice, but enough for Himat Ali. He didn't measure his days by clocks or calendars, but by the tiny, unchanging rhythms of the village. He stood at the entrance of his store, his hand resting on the crooked wooden door as he pushed it open. The hinges groaned their usual greeting, yet the air outside was still. It felt heavy, expectant. The silence was thicker than usual, as though the whole world was holding its breath. The village itself felt out of step. The houses looked the same, leaning slightly, sunburned, half forgotten. The dusty road looked the same, long and lonely, stretching out toward a city that no longer remembered it even existed. But there was something in the way the shadows fell this morning. Something about how the dust settled instead of rising. Something about the way the sunlight seemed slower, dimmer, almost hesitant. Even the stray dog that always slept beneath the neem tree didn't stir when Himat opened the store. It was as if the entire village had paused for a moment, confused by something it couldn't quite understand. By mid-morning, Himat noticed something else. No one had come to the store. Not Shehzada Khan for his morning cigarette. Not Amma Bibi for her salt and vegetables. Not the children who would sometimes wander in just to stare blankly at the biscuit packets. On the high shelves, there were no footsteps, no soft shuffle of sandals on the dusty ground. No familiar voices calling his name. The store, which was always quiet, felt quiet. So quiet that the creaking of the old ceiling boards sounded louder than usual. Himat stood behind the counter, staring at a shelf that always seemed to shift slightly on its own. Today, it looked back at him motionless, ordinary, but somehow different. Something was off. Something had begun. When the wind finally did arrive, it entered the store timidly, as if testing the air before stepping fully inside. It brushed past the door and drifted across the shelves, lifting a thin layer of dust. But the dust didn't flow lazily like it usually did. It spiraled slowly and deliberately, before settling again in a strange circular pattern on the counter. Himat's eyes narrowed. Not in fear. Fear was a luxury Darya village had long forgotten, but in a kind of mild curiosity. The pattern was small, barely noticeable, but it was new. And in Darya, anything new was unusual. He reached out, slowly clearing the dust with his hand. As he did, the wind seemed to pull back, as if it was watching, as if it was waiting. The door creaked again, not with its usual weary sigh, but with a sharper edge, like a voice trying to get someone's attention. Himat looked up. Miriam stood in the doorway. Her long braid was slightly undone, and strands of hair blew around her face despite the weak wind. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a kind of awareness. You felt it too, she said softly. Himat didn't need to ask what she meant. He knew. Yes, he answered. The village is slower today. Miriam stepped inside, and the floorboards beneath her feet creaked, each one sounding louder than it should have. It's like everything woke up before we did, she said, her voice low. And then it just stopped. She looked around the store, scanning the shelves as if checking to see if any of them had moved. Himad watched her quietly. The store itself seemed to be watching her too. Just as Miriam reached the counter, a sound floated through the still air. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. It was soft, distant, almost like the rustle of old fabric or the sigh of a rope swinging gently in the wind. Himad stiffened slightly. Miriam's eyes flickered toward the back of the store. What was that? She whispered. Nothing, Himad said, though for the first time, even he didn't sound convinced. The sound came again. A fainty dragging, a fainty tapping, a fainty something. It was coming from behind the thick, heavy curtain that separated the front of the store from the storage room. The storage room no one ever entered. Not even the other villagers. Not even Miriam. Not even, it seemed, Himad, at least not for a very long time. Miriam took a small step backward. Is someone in there? No, Himad said quietly, his eyes fixed on the dark curtain. No one has been in there for years. The gentle wind pushed against the curtain, making it sway just slightly. It wasn't enough to reveal anything. It was just enough to suggest something. Something behind it, something awake, something waiting. Miriam swallowed, her voice barely audible. Should we look? Himad did not answer immediately. He stood very still, breathing slowly, listening. The sound came once more, softer now, almost shy. He took a step toward the curtain, then another. The shelf behind him gave the faintest shiver. The door behind Miriam creaked. Though no one had touched it, a speck of dust drifted downward from the ceiling, spiraling again, almost deliberately. The village had been waiting for something, and now, whatever it was beginning. Himad reached out and slowly took hold of the curtain's rough edge. For the first time in Darya Village's long, quiet, forgotten history, something was about to happen. Something that nobody was prepared for. Something that would change the village forever. The curtain at the back of the store had always been a boundary. Not a wall, not a door, just a faded piece of cloth, hanging loosely from a rusted rod. Yet, it separated two worlds. The part of the store everyone knew, and the part no one ever questioned. No one asked what lay behind it. No one wondered why it was always closed. No one cared enough to even guess. Except today. Today, the curtain moved. Not because of the wind. Himad knew the difference. He had worked in this store for years. He knew the drafts, the way the breeze whispered through the cracks in the walls. This was different. The curtain swayed with intention, a deliberate movement, like something behind it had just brushed against the fabric. Himad's hand tightened on the edge of the cloth. He pulled it aside, just enough to create a small gap. A breath of colder air, unnaturally cold for the season, drifted out. Across the room, Miriam stood frozen near the counter, watching him with wide, unblinking eyes. Her voice was a fragile whisper. What do you see? Himad didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't sure what he was seeing. The storage room behind the curtain wasn't large. He remembered it well from years ago, a place he'd occasionally used to store empty jars or unused tools. But as he peered inside now, something was fundamentally wrong. The room looked deeper, wider, dimmer, as if it had grown without permission, stretching itself out in the shadows. The walls were darker than he remembered, the corners swallowed in a deep gloom, even though stray sunlight should have reached at least part of the room through the gaps in the ceiling. And then there was the smell. It wasn't a bad smell, not rotten or musty. It was just old, an ancient, profound age that didn't belong to Darya Village, an age that felt like it was measured in centuries, not years. Himad took a slow step inside. The old wooden floorboards creaked under his weight. Miriam remained at the entrance, clutching the curtain as if it were an anchor, holding her fast to the safe, familiar half of the store. Himad, she murmured, her voice trembling. Then he heard it again, tap. The sound came from the far corner of the room, soft, but clear. Tap. Hemant paused, his eyes straining to adjust to the dimness. The shadows seemed thicker here, clinging to the walls like damp, black paint. Tappy. Something was there. He knew it instinctively. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a tool falling from a shelf. It wasn't the wind. He walked further in, his steps slow, steady, each footstep measured and deliberate. The air grew colder with each step, a chill that seeped into his bones. At the very back of the room, almost completely hidden by the encroaching shadows, stood an old wooden chest. He had forgotten it even existed. It was covered in a thick layer of dust. Its iron hinges rusted a deep, angry orange. The lid was slightly crooked, as if someone had tried to pry it open years ago and given up. The chest had been here since before Hemant had even arrived in the village, a silent, forgotten fixture. Tap. The sound came from inside the chest. There was no mistaking it this time. Mariam's breath hitched behind him. "That's not possible," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Hemant crouched slowly, his eyes fixed on the chest. The dust on the lid was thick and perfectly undisturbed, a smooth, gray blanket that had settled over decades. Except for one thing, one impossible detail, a small, circular imprint. Fresh, as if a fingertip or something like a fingertip had pressed into it just moments ago. "How long has this been here?" Mariam asked, her fear warring with a dawning curiosity. "Yours," Hemant said softly, his voice barely audible. "Maybe longer. Who does it belong to?" He shook his head. "No one knows." He had never opened it, never even tried. He'd never had a reason to. For all he knew, it held nothing more than empty jars or old, faded receipts from the store's earliest days. But something deep in his mind, a quiet instinct buried beneath years of mundane routine, told him that wasn't true. He reached out. His fingers brushed against the lid, but what felt colder than it should. Much colder. A deep, unnatural cold that seemed to draw the warmth from his skin. Tap. The sound came again, sharp this time, urgent, insistent. Mariam took a hasty step back. "Don't open it, Hemant." But Hemant didn't move his hand away. He rested it on the lid for a moment, feeling that strange, deep chill, the faint vibration that seemed to run through the wood. "There's something inside," he said quietly. "We don't need to know what it is." Her voice was pleading now. "We do." His own voice surprised him. He wasn't a man who spoke with such conviction. He was a quiet store owner in a quiet, forgotten village. But something about this moment, something about the chest, something about the strange and unsettling way the village seemed to be waking up today. It made him sure. The chest wanted to be opened. Or maybe it needed to be. Hemant pressed his fingers beneath the small, rusted gap in the lid. The metal groaned in protest. Dust shook loose in a fine cloud, dancing in the dim light. The hinges trembled. With a surge of strength he didn't know he possessed, he lifted the lid. Slowly, Mariam turned her face slightly away, bracing herself for whatever lay within. As the lid rose, a thin beam of sunlight slipped in behind them, cutting through the gloom and illuminating the inside of the chest. Hemant froze. Mariam, sensing his stillness, turned back. "What is it?" The chest was not empty, nor was it filled with old tools or forgotten trinkets. Inside, lying perfectly in the center, was a notebook, a thin, old notebook with a dark, featureless cover. Its edges were frayed, its pages yellowed with an impossible age. It rested neatly as though placed there with great care, not tossed, not forgotten. And beneath the notebook, Hemant's breath caught in his throat. There was something else. Something wrapped in old, gray cloth. It was small, delicate, and it was shaped like... "What is that?" Mariam asked, her voice barely a whisper. But Hemant didn't answer. He couldn't, because the cloth-wrapped object beneath the notebook had just begun to move. Just slightly. A gentle, rhythmic rise and fall, as though it were breathing. And in that same instant, the wind outside suddenly stopped. Completely. The silence that fell was absolute, so thick and heavy it seemed to press against the store walls, muffling the very world. The curtain behind Mariam fluttered once, violently, without any wind to move it. The floorboards trembled, a deep tremor that rose from the very foundations of the earth. Something was waking up, not just in the chest, not just in the strange, expanding storage room, in the village itself, and in that suspended, silent moment, as the cloth-covered object inside the chest pulsed softly, like a tiny, nascent heartbeat. Hemad realized something with a chilling, bone-deep clarity. For the first time in many, many decades, Darya village was no longer forgotten. It was being remembered by something. The morning after the lantern mishap felt unusually still. There was no breeze, no birdsong, not even the distant sound of goats bleating. It was as if the entire village had collectively decided to hold its breath. Elena stepped out of her house, and the weight of that silence immediately settled around her shoulders like a thick shawl. The dew on the ground was thicker than usual, almost syrupy, and it clung to her shoes as she walked. A faint, indescribable scent hung in the air, something like old paper mixed with wet stone. Elena paused, sniffing again. She frowned. She had smelled this before. She was sure of it, but she couldn't remember when. Her memory, still fragile from yesterday's strange moment, felt like an old door that refused to open fully. She decided to take the long path that circled behind Mr. Dalby's abandoned barn, a path the villagers casually called the Whispering Path. No one knew who named it. No one even remembered talking about it. The name simply existed, like the moss on the old roofs, and that alone made Elena curious. As she reached the entrance of the narrow trail, something happened. Her ears tingled. It was a strange sensation, as if someone had just breathed gently against her skin. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. The village behind her looked normal, quiet, yes, but normal. The roof sat peacefully. The wells and windows were unchanged, and nothing in sight seemed dangerous. Still, her heart thumped quietly as she stepped forward. The trees along the path leaned inward, unnaturally, their branches arching above her like the ribs of a hollow creature. Their leaves were a dull, almost gray-green, and none of them moved. Even when Elena brushed past them, they stayed stiff, as if reluctant to acknowledge her presence. Then she heard it, a voice, soft, faint, not quite words. Not quite a sound, more like a memory of words someone had spoken long ago. Her own name, Elena. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. She spun around, expecting someone to be there. But there was nothing except the bend in the path and the thick trees. Her palms started sweating, but she swallowed hard and forced herself to remain calm. It's just the wind, she told herself. But she knew there was no wind. She walked deeper, and the path narrowed. The soil beneath her was darker here, and oddly warm to the touch. It made her feel like she was walking over something living. At one point, the whisper came again. This time clearer. Not yet, she blinked. Not yet what? Her steps slowed. A prickling sensation crawled up her arms, as if dozens of invisible threads were brushing against her skin. She knew she should turn back. The village, boring and plain as it had always been, suddenly felt safe and comforting again. But she also knew that whatever this place was, it held the other half of the truth she had almost remembered yesterday, the truth that had slipped out of her grasp like fog. After a few more steps, she saw something unexpected, a stone marker on the side of the path. She knelt to inspect it. The stone was covered in moss and cracks, but a symbol was carved into it, a circle with 3 short lines inside. It reminded her of the lantern emblem she had found yesterday on the old cloth in the attic. Her fingertips traced it slowly. She whispered, "Why does everything feel older than it should?" The moment she touched the center of the symbol, a shock traveled up her hand. It wasn't painful, but it was startling, like dipping your fingers into perfectly still, ice-cold water. And suddenly, a memory flickered. A crowd, a night sky, dozens of lanterns being carried by villagers, except the villagers looked younger. The buildings were slightly different, the lamps were brighter. And then nothing. The memory snapped shut like a slammed door. Elena staggered back, her heart racing. The whispering stopped, the silence returned, heavier now. She realized she was trembling, and backed away from the stone marker, carefully, as if it could move at any moment. Then she heard another noise, the first real sound since she entered the path. Footsteps. Behind her. Slow, steady, soft. She turned and saw no one. But the footsteps continued, coming closer. She took a step back. The footsteps took a step forward. Her throat tightened. "Elena!" The whisper came again, this time from the direction of the village. She panicked and ran. She had never run that fast on that uneven ground before. Branches scraped her arms, stones twisted under her shoes. But she kept going until she burst out of the path and back into the open village. The moment she reached the sunlight, the whispers stopped, and the birds began to sing again, as if nothing had happened. Elena leaned forward, catching her breath, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her mind raced with questions, but one thought rose louder than the rest. That path, it remembered her, and whatever was hidden in this village, whatever everyone kept forgetting, was getting closer. Much closer. Elena decided she would not tell anyone about what happened on the Whispering Path. At least not yet. She needed to understand it herself before she invited questions she couldn't even begin to answer. But as she walked back into the main square of the village, something felt undeniably different. The air had returned to its normal state, warm and crisp. Yet the people, they looked quieter than usual. They moved so slowly, as though their thoughts were wrapped in thick cotton, muffled and distant. At the very center of the square stood the old stone well. It had always been there, a silent sentinel older than the village itself, or so the stories went. People rarely used it now, not since the new, efficient water tank had been installed. But it remained an important landmark. Its rope and bucket preserved more out of a deep-seated respect than any real utility. And someone was standing beside it, a man not tall, not thin. He was wearing a faded brown coat that looked several decades old. Not old in the sense that it was worn out, but old in its style. Like a relic from a time she couldn't quite place. His hat was tilted low, hiding most of his face from view. Elena slowed her steps, a feeling of unease prickling her skin. She knew almost everyone in this village by face, if not by name. But this man, she had never seen him before. He didn't move. He didn't look up. He just stood there with one hand resting lightly on the well stone rim, as if he were listening to something deep inside it. Elena hesitated for a moment, then cautiously approached him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft so as not to startle him. "Are you looking for someone?" The man didn't answer right away. A long, heavy moment passed before he finally lifted his head, just slightly. She still couldn't see his eyes, only the sharp, pale line of his jaw, completely unmoving. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but it carried strangely in the still air, reaching her with an unsettling clarity. "I'm looking for what's missing." Elena's stomach tightened into a knot. "Missing," she repeated, her own voice barely a whisper. "Yes." He tapped the stone edge of the well with a long, slender finger. "This place has many things missing, but none of you notice." A chill crawled up her spine, cold and deliberate. "Who are you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man tilted his head, a strange, bird-like movement, as if he were considering the question for the very first time. "Someone who remembers." He paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. "And someone who watches." Before Elena could even think of a response, he straightened his coat, turned, and began walking away. He moved toward the far side of the square, where the houses became older and fewer in number, their shadows stretching long in the morning light. "Wait," Elena called out, a sense of urgency rising in her. "What do you mean by missing? What's missing?" The man didn't stop walking, but he did speak, his words barely above a whisper, yet they seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the square. "The village," he said, "has forgotten a part of itself, and soon it will forget more." And just like that, he disappeared around a corner, swallowed by the labyrinth of old stone and fading memories. Elena stood frozen, rooted to the spot. A strange pressure was tightening in her chest, an uncomfortable mix of dread and something that felt disturbingly like recognition. She frantically looked around to see if anyone else had noticed him, this mysterious stranger who spoke in riddles. But the villagers just wandered about their morning, tasks with those same empty, slow expressions. Someone was carrying a basket of cabbages. Another was sweeping their steps. A third was hanging laundry on a line. No one, absolutely no one, seemed aware of the man at all. It was as if he had been completely invisible to them. She saw an older woman passing by, a kind face she'd known for years. "Excuse me," Elena said, her voice trembling slightly. "Did you see that? A man by the well." The woman frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "A man by the well." She blinked slowly, her gaze distant. "No one was there, dear." Elena swallowed hard, the dryness in her throat making it difficult. She turned back to the well, her eyes scanning its surface. The stone around its rim was damp. A small puddle of water glistened on it, catching the morning sunlight like a tiny, captured star. And then she saw them. Thin grooves, fresh ones, had been carved into the mossy surface. It looked as though someone had traced a symbol there with their fingertip, a circle, with 3 short lines inside. Her breath hitched. It was the same symbol from the attic cloth, the same symbol from the stone marker on the whispering path. Leaning in, her heart was now pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt that elusive memory struggling again, almost surfacing a flash of something. About lanterns, about a gathering, about a night long ago. She tried to pull the memory up, to grasp it, to see it clearly. But something pushed it back down that hard. It was like a door slamming shut in her mind. Elena stumbled slightly, gripping the well's cold, damp edge to steady herself. The world blurred for a second, and she felt a strange, unnatural coldness wash over her, seeping into her bones despite the warm sun. When her vision cleared, she noticed someone else approaching, the village elder, Murdad Harun. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, lined with age, but his eyes were usually warm and kind. Today, however, they looked different. They were wide, uncertain, and filled with an emotion she'd never seen in him before: fear. "Elena," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "Did you just speak to someone here?" She hesitated, unsure of what to say, what he would believe. "Yes, a man that tall, wearing a brown coat, mister." Harun stared at her for a long, agonizing moment, then placed a trembling hand on the rim of the well, right where the strangers had been. "Child," he whispered, his voice cracking. "No outsider has entered this village in 23 years. Elena felt her heartbeat stop for a moment. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "How can that be?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Because, mister," Harun said, lowering his voice even further, his eyes darting around nervously as if the very walls had ears. "This village does not attract visitors." He glanced around again, a frantic, hunted look on his face. "And those who know the old paths, they never return." Elena's breath caught in her throat. Harun looked at her with an expression of deep, profound worry. "Stay away from the well," he said, his voice firm but trembling. "And whatever you do, do not go back to that path." But Elena knew something he didn't. As she stood there, the mysterious symbol burning in her mind's eye, a new resolve hardened within her. She already planned to go back, because the village was remembering her, in fragments and whispers, through symbols and forgotten paths. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone and yet filled her with a strange purpose, that she needed to remember it back. Thanks for watching. And if you want to follow Elena's journey, the night after the strange rumor began circulating, Darya Village fell into a deeper quiet than usual. This wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet you'd find in a sleeping town. No, this was a listening quiet. It felt as if the entire village, every house, every tree, and every shadow held its breath, waiting for something to happen, or perhaps fearing that it already had. Himad Ali felt it too. He closed his small general store much earlier than usual, pulling the heavy wooden door shut and sliding the bolt across. Normally, he would light the old kerosene lantern that hung by the entrance, its warm glow spilling onto the dusty street. Then, He'd settle onto his worn wooden stool just outside the door, watching the last embers of daylight fade from the sky. It was his ritual, a small comfort in a life of sameness. But not tonight. Tonight, he didn't light the lantern. He didn't sit on the stool. Instead, he stood in the very center of his shop, enveloped in the growing darkness. His eyes were fixed on the floor. The wooden tiles beneath his worn leather shoes were a patchwork of time uneven, some cracked with age, others sagging under the weight of countless footsteps. But one plank, right near the counter, had always been different. It was a darker shade of wood, a rich, deep brown against the faded gray of the others. Its surface was a little smoother, the grain less pronounced, a little newer, but only a little, just enough for someone to notice if they were looking, but not enough to ever question. It was just another quirk of the old building. Tonight, however, that single board seemed to pull his attention like a magnet. A strange, insistent gravity drew his gaze downward. He didn't know why. He didn't know what he expected to find. He only knew that the store's boring, predictable, utterly uneventful store felt different in the dark. Too different. The familiar shadows seemed to stretch and warp, and the silence was heavy, suffocating. As the wind outside, which had been rattling the shutters, began to die down, the store grew unnaturally still. The silence became so profound that it was almost a sound in itself. And within that profound silence, Himmat thought he heard something. It was faint, almost too soft to register a hum. A low vibration that seemed to come not through his ears, but up through the soles of his feet. No, it was more like a whisper, a trembling murmur that originated from somewhere deep beneath the ground itself. He moved slowly, deliberately, his joints creaking in protest. He knelt, the rough fabric of his trousers scratching against the floor. With a hesitation that felt foreign to him, he pressed his ear against the different wooden plank. The wood was cool against his skin. For a moment, there was nothing, just the frantic pounding of his own heart against his ribs. Then a soft thud. It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening or aggressive. It was just present, a single, distinct knock, as if someone or something trapped deep below the floorboards. Had gently, almost politely, rapped for attention. Himmat froze. The air in his lungs turned to ice. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The sound echoed not in the room, but inside his skull. Slowly, painstakingly, he pushed himself up, his legs trembling. He backed away from the board, taking small, careful steps, like a man retreating from the edge of a cliff in the dead of night. This wasn't here before, he whispered, the words barely audible in the crushing silence of the shop. But as soon as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Of course it had been here. The board had always been there. The store had always been the same. Everything in Darya Village was always the same. That was its defining feature, its curse, and its comfort. So then why tonight? Why, after decades of silent obedience, did the floor suddenly feel alive? His hands, now shaking visibly, fumbled for the lantern on the counter. He struck a match, the sudden flare of light making him flinch. He tried to ignite the wick, but the flame sputtered and died. He tried again. It flared, flickered, and went out. On the third try, the flame finally caught, casting a weak, hesitant glow across the cluttered shelves. But even then, the light was strange. It pulsed with an odd reluctance, as if the flame itself was afraid of what it might illuminate. He picked up the lantern, its metal handle cold in his sweaty palm. As he moved it closer to the odd plank on the floor, the flame shrank back. It became small, nervous, and trembling, casting dancing, distorted shadows that looked like grasping fingers. Himmat wasn't a man who frightened easily. He'd lived through famines, floods, and the quiet desperation of a forgotten village. But fear wasn't a common visitor here. Nothing frightening ever happened in Darya, and that, he realized, was the problem. He wasn't prepared for something strange. He had no tools, no experience, no defense against the unknown. With a surge of desperate resolve, his eyes landed on a rusted screwdriver lying on a dusty shelf. It was a tool rarely used, kept for tasks that never seemed to rise. Tonight, As he picked it up, it felt unnaturally heavy in his hand, a cold, solid piece of reality in a world that was quickly unraveling. He approached the board again, the weak lantern light his only companion. He crouched, holding the light close. He saw the nails. 1 nail, 2 nails, 3 nails, securing the plank to the joist below, and a new wave of cold dread washed over him. Each nail head was oddly clean. They weren't rusted like every other piece of metal in the shop. They weren't bent or covered in decades of grime. They looked fresh, shiny, as if someone had replaced them not long ago. But who would do such a thing? No one came into the store without him knowing. His life revolved around this small space. He knew every creak, every stain, every loose nail. And no one had touched this floor not in decades. Sweat beaded on his forehead and trickled down the back of his neck. He took a shaky breath and tried to wedge the tip of the screwdriver under the head of the first nail. He pushed. It didn't move. It was set firm, deep into the wood. He gritted his teeth and pressed harder, putting his weight into it. As the metal scraped against the nail, the whisper from beneath the floorboards grew louder. It wasn't words. It was just a sound. A deep, resonant, trembling vibration that hummed through the wood, up the screwdriver, and into his bones. It felt like something waiting, like something waking up. Himmat's heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silent shop. He scrambled backward, dropping the screwdriver with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. He was suddenly, utterly overwhelmed by a primal fear he couldn't name or explain. A fear that didn't belong in a boring store and a boring village, where the most exciting event of the year was the first mango of the season. He couldn't do it. He couldn't face what was under the board. With a flick of his thumb, he turned off the lantern, plunging the room back into darkness. He felt his way to the shelf and placed the screwdriver back in its dusty spot. He walked to the door, his eyes fixed firmly ahead, refusing to look back at the floor. At the spot where the darkness seemed deepest, he slid the bolt open, and in a voice barely louder than a breath, a broken promise to himself, he said, "I'll check it tomorrow." He stepped out into the night, pulling the door shut behind him, and from within the sealed, silent store, the floor whispered again. The sound was soft, persistent, almost disappointed, as if it knew something that Himmat Ali, in his desperate bid for one more night of normalcy, did not. Tomorrow would be too late. The next morning arrived with an unusual heaviness, as if the sun itself hesitated before rising over Darya village. The light felt weaker, washed out, and pale, almost as though it didn't want to reveal what the night had left behind. But no one noticed this, of course. The villagers rarely noticed anything. They went about their days in a haze of routine, their eyes fixed on the dusty ground before them, never looking up, never questioning. But there was one person who did. A child. The only child who paid attention. Safa was 9 years old, curious, quiet, and far more observant than any adult around her. In Darya village, children didn't run or shout or play like children did elsewhere. They moved with the same slow, resigned pace as their parents, their youthful energy seemingly absorbed by the village's oppressive silence. But Safa was different. Safa watched. She noticed the way dust motes danced in a stray sunbeam. She noticed how the wind seemed to hold its breath before blowing again. She noticed when something felt just a little bit wrong. And this morning, she noticed Himmat Ali. He stood outside his general store, a small, weathered building that was the closest thing Darya village had to a center. He just stood there, staring at the familiar wooden door as if he wasn't sure whether to open it. This alone was a major break from the norm. Himmat always opened his store at the exact same time every single day. It was a ritual, a certainty carved into the village's dull, predictable routine. But today, he hesitated. His shoulders were slumped, and his face, usually set in a look of quiet resignation, was pale with an unspoken anxiety. Safa approached, her small sandals brushing the dirt so quietly that she made almost no sound. "Uncle Himmat," she said softly, her voice a small ripple in the morning stillness. "Why aren't you going inside?" Hemant blinked, startled. He hadn't heard her come. He spun around, his eyes wide for a second before he forced a weak, unconvincing smile. "Oh, Safa, I'm just tired. That's all." Safa frowned, her brow furrowing with a seriousness that didn't belong on a 9-year-old's face. "You're never tired," she stated simply. He didn't reply, because she was right. He was never tired. He was reliable. He was constant. But today, something was broken. Something had visited the store. Finally, with a deep, shaky breath, Hemant pushed the door open. The old iron hinges creaked, the sound echoing louder than normal in the tense silence. Inside, everything looked the same at first glance. The familiar clutter of tools, sacks of grain, and jars of spices sat just as they always did. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and dried herbs. But something felt different. An invisible wrongness hung in the air. A subtle disturbance only someone who knew the space intimately could feel. The fine layer of dust on the counter had been disturbed. It wasn't wiped away, but it looked as though a single fingertip had traced a clean, deliberate line through it. A wrench on a high shelf had moved, maybe an inch to the right, but it was enough. The lid on a glass jar of lentils was slightly loose, not screwed on tight like him had always left it. To anyone else, these details would mean nothing. Random, insignificant. But to Hemant, they were impossible. He had locked the store securely last night. No one had a key. No one entered. No one ever entered after he left. Except his eyes drifted down, pulled by an instinct he couldn't explain. They landed on a specific section of the floor. A floorboard, one darker plank, its surface smoother than the others around it. It was the source of the whisper he had heard last night, a sound he had tried to dismiss as the wind. He approached it slowly, his heart thumping against his ribs. Safa, forgotten for a moment, had followed him in. Uninvited, but unnoticed, she watched him, her own senses on high alert. Then, Hemant froze, his breath caught in his throat. There, on that specific wooden plank, was a mark, a single, thin scratch, cut deep into the wood. It was fresh, so fresh that the edges of the scratch still showed pale, raw wood beneath the dark, aged surface. It wasn't an old mark. It wasn't an accident. It was new. It had been made last night. Safa, seeing his gaze fixed on the floor, crouched down beside him. Her small finger hovered over the scratch but didn't touch it. "It looks like something tried to come out," she whispered, her voice filled with a child's unfiltered honesty. Hemant's breath stopped completely. He had thought the exact same thing, but hearing the thought spoken aloud, hearing it from this child, made it terrifyingly real. A cold dread washed over him, a fear he hadn't felt in years. "What made this?" Safa asked, looking up at his face, her dark eyes searching for an answer. Hemant forced himself to speak, his voice strained and hoarse. "Probably a mouse." But the lie was hollow. They both knew it wasn't a mouse. Not a scratch that clean, that deep, not in that specific place. Not after the whisper he had heard, the whisper that had promised to return. Before either of them could speak again, a sound from outside shattered the tension. Footsteps slow, heavy, and utterly unfamiliar. In Daryu village, an unfamiliar sound was more shocking than a clap of thunder. Everyone knew everyone else's gait, the shuffle of their feet, the rhythm of their walk. This was different. This was the sound of a stranger. Instinctively, Safa and Hemant moved together, stepping out of the dim store and back into the pale morning light. There, standing in the middle of the old dirt road, was a man. He was tall and lean, covered in a layer of dust that suggested a long journey. His clothes were faded beyond recognition, their original color lost to sun and time. A small, worn bag hung from his shoulder. But what struck Hemant wasn't the man's appearance. It was the way he was looking at the village. His gaze wasn't confused, like a lost traveler. It wasn't curious, like a passerby. It was knowing. He looked at the forgotten, crumbling houses and the silent, dusty streets as if he had been here before. as if he expected to find this forgotten village exactly as it was. His eyes scanned the landscape with a sense of ownership, a chilling familiarity. Safa, standing close to Hemant, felt a shiver run down her spine. She whispered, her voice barely audible, "Who is he?" Hemant swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He didn't know the man's name or where he came from, but as he watched the stranger's gaze slowly sweep across the village and finally settle on his store, he suddenly felt very sure of one thing. The stranger wasn't a traveler. He wasn't lost, and he certainly wasn't just passing by. He was here for the village, or worse, he was here for the store, and for what was hidden beneath it. The stranger didn't move at first. He stood at the edge of the village road, a silhouette against the pale dust, as if he were measuring the silence, feeling the weight of the place. He was studying it, the way a doctor studies an old, faded scar. His eyes drifted over every house, every crumbling wall, every sun-bleached rooftop, and then they settled on the store. It wasn't just a glance. He didn't just notice it, he focused. It was as if our little, forgotten store was the only reason he had come all this way. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Nobody, not even the rare travelers passing through, ever paid any attention to the store. Most didn't even look twice at it. But this man looked at it like he already knew what was inside, or what was beneath. When the stranger finally started walking toward the shop, each step felt unnervingly slow, deliberate, as if he were trying not to disturb something fragile, something sleeping. My younger sister, Safa, stayed behind me, her small hands gripping the edge of my shirt. The man reached the store entrance. He paused for a heartbeat, then gently pushed the half-crooked door. It creaked, but not like it usually did. This time, the sound echoed strangely. It was sharp, distant, almost metallic. It was as if something deep inside the store answered the creak with a whisper of its own. The stranger stepped inside. He didn't look around at the dusty shelves or the cobwebs in the corners. He walked straight to the counter, straight to the exact spot where the floorboard had whispered to me the night before. He placed a small, worn bag on the counter, then turned to me. His eyes were quiet, unreadable pools of shadow. "You've heard it, haven't you?" I froze. My own breath felt trapped in my chest. Heard? Heard what? I managed to get out, my voice barely a croak. The stranger tilted his head slightly, a flicker of something like disappointment in his gaze. The voice beneath the floor. Safa gasped softly behind me. The air in the store suddenly felt thick, heavy, the walls closing in. I couldn't lie, not because I thought the stranger would know, but because the whisper itself seemed to stir at his question, as if it were listening. "How do you know?" I whispered, the words feeling alien on my tongue. The stranger didn't answer directly. Instead, he crouched down, his movements fluid and certain. He touched the scratched, loose plank gently with 2 fingers, as if he were greeting an old, familiar friend. "This board wasn't always here," he murmured, his voice low and calm. "It was placed to hide something old, something that's only dangerous if it's ignored." I took an involuntary step back, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Safa, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity, whispered the question I was too scared to ask. "Did you put it here?" The stranger shook his head slowly. "No, I only came to see if it has begun." His words hung in the dusty air like a gathering storm cloud, promising a rain I wasn't sure we could survive. Then, he opened his bag. Inside were things that had no place in Darya Village. Things from another world, another time. There were old, brittle documents tied with string, notebooks with stitched spines, a thin, sharp chisel, and a folded map, yellow and fragile with age. He pulled out the map first. When he unfolded it on the counter, my breath caught in my throat. Safa's eyes widened in disbelief. It was our village, Darya Village, drawn clearly, marked deliberately. We weren't a forgotten smudge on the edge of nowhere. We weren't missing. We were centered, highlighted, circled with dark, permanent ink, as if the entire region existed only as a frame. Around us, I finally found my voice. A mere whisper, But Darya isn't on most maps. The stranger simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the ink circle. On most maps, yes, but on the real ones. This village is the first thing you mark. Why? The question screamed in my mind, but my voice wouldn't obey. I couldn't bring myself to ask. So Safa, braver than I was, asked for me. Why did you come here? The stranger's gaze shifted from the map back to the floorboard beneath his feet, to unbury something the village tried to forget. He slowly stood up, his full height seeming to shrink the small store even more. He looked me straight in the eyes, and for the first time, I saw a profound seriousness there, a deep and ancient sorrow, and to warn you, fear, cold and sharp, crawled at my throat, choking me. Warn us about what? The stranger's voice dropped, becoming as soft and chilling as the whisper from below. About what wakes when Darya village remembers. For a long moment, no one spoke. Dust hung in the air, suspended like tiny grains of time. Outside, the wind paused. Even the dry riverbed seemed to hold its breath. I felt something unfamiliar spreading in the pit of my stomach, fear mixed with recognition. As if a memory I never had was trying to return. The stranger folded the old map carefully and set it aside. Then he began. This village was not always quiet. His voice was low but steady, carrying the weight of someone who had walked through too many forgotten places. Darya village once had noise, people, movement, festivals, stories that traveled far beyond the riverbed. It was alive. Safa blinked, her small voice cutting through the stillness. But it's always been boring. The stranger smiled faintly, a sad, knowing look in his eyes. No, child, it was made boring. My brow furrowed. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Who would do that? Everyone. The stranger replied, his gaze sweeping over both of us. The villagers themselves. The room seemed to dim. Shadows stretched a little longer across the old wooden countertop. The stranger tapped a floorboard gently with the tip of his boot. Many years ago, before your grandparents, even before their grandparents, something was found beneath this very land. Something ancient, something not meant for everyone. My heartbeat slowed to a heavy thud in my chest. Each word he spoke felt heavier than the last. This store, the stranger continued, gesturing around us, was built directly above the place. Not to protect it, not to honor it, but to hide it. Safa's voice was barely a whisper. Hide what? The stranger hesitated for the first time. He looked down at the floor as if trying to decide how much truth to reveal, how much we could handle. A relic, he finally said, from before the village even existed. A small object, no bigger than a lantern, but powerful in a way no one fully understood. My throat tightened. The air felt thick, hard to breathe. What does it do? No one knows, the stranger said quietly. Or perhaps no one wanted to know. He stood up and walked slowly toward the front door, staring outside as if the sky itself carried the memory of what happened next. The villagers who discovered it began to change. Not in their bodies, in their minds. Safa edged closer to me, her eyes wide and frightened, listening intently to his every word. What happened to them? She asked. The stranger closed his eyes for a moment, as if replaying a terrible scene. They remembered things they had no reason to remember. Dreams that were not theirs. Voices that were not human. Thoughts that belonged to a time older than the soil beneath their feet. The store suddenly felt colder. A draft I hadn't noticed before seemed to snake around my ankles. A few became obsessed. He went on. A few became frightened, and one tried to take the relic away. I felt a sudden, sharp chill run down my spine. What happened to him? The stranger turned, his gaze darkening, locking onto mine. He disappeared, without a trace. The ground swallowed him as if he never existed. Safa winced, a small sound of fear escaping her lips. My hands trembled where they rested on the counter. And so, the stranger continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The remaining villagers made a decision. They filled the chamber. They sealed it. They built the store over it. And then they swore an oath, a pact of silence, never to speak of it again. He let the words settle, and the heavy air between us. The silence was profound, filled with the ghosts of generations of secrets. Over generations, the story faded, then it blurred, then it vanished entirely, until nothing remained but a deep, unspoken instinct to forget, to keep things quiet, to keep Darya Village boring. Safa's whisper was urgent. But something is waking now. The stranger nodded slowly, his expression grim. Yes, and that's the problem. He crouched again, this time placing his palm flat on the scratch plank in the floor. This scratch, it means the seal below is weakening. Something inside is moving. Not alive, not like you or me, but aware. I swallowed hard. Aware. The word felt wrong. Too heavy. Too alive. I forced out a question, my voice raspy. Why now? After so many years. The stranger stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the small space of the store. Because the village is no longer forgetting. He pointed a finger at Safa. She noticed the scratch. She noticed the dust. She noticed the whisper. Then his eyes shifted to me, pinning me in place. And you heard it. My breath caught in my throat. He was right. I had heard it. The relic responds to attention, the stranger said, stepping closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hush, to memory, to recognition. He paused, letting the implications sink in. The more you notice, the more it wakes. Safa clutched my hand tightly, her small fingers digging into my palm. And once it fully wakes, the stranger whispered, his voice barely audible, but ringing with a terrible finality. Darya Village will no longer be the place the world ignores. He took a slow, deep breath, as if steeling himself. It will become impossible to forget. The weight of his words settled upon us. A promise and a threat all at once. The quiet, boring village I had known my entire life was a lie, a carefully constructed cage. And now, thanks to us, the lock was breaking. The silence of Darya Village was about to end. And I had a terrible feeling that the noise to come would be something no one was prepared for. What was this relic? And what would it do to us, to our home, now that we had remembered it into existence? The stranger's eyes held no answers, only the reflection of a dawning dread that was now mirrored in my own. The store was quieter than it had ever been. Even the usual creaks of the roof and the floor seemed to hold their breath. Himmat Ali, Safa, and the stranger stood in a tense triangle. Around the scratched plank, the air thick with anticipation and something else. Something almost tangible, pulsing faintly just beneath the wood. The stranger knelt down slowly, his movements deliberate, placing his palms flat against the old floorboard. He looked up at Himmat, his gaze piercing the dim light. Are you ready? He asked quietly. Himmat hesitated. A lifetime of hesitation flashed through his mind. He had never been ready for anything, not for the violent storms that lashed the coast, not for the rare visitors who brought news of a world he'd forgotten, and certainly not for change. But this felt different. It was larger than fear. It felt like standing on the very edge of the world and being asked to step forward anyway, into the unknown. He started, his voice a dry whisper. I don't know if do it anyway. Safa interrupted, her voice soft but unyielding. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering lantern light, but they were filled with a fierce determination. We have to know. The stranger nodded, a slow, knowing gesture. Good. You understand better than most. With a final glance at Himmat, he gripped the corner of the plank. It came up slowly, resisting at first, the old nails groaning in protest. Then, it gave way with a soft, final sigh. The dust beneath it was fine, almost sparkling in the dim light, like a scattering of tiny, forgotten stars. A strange scent rose from the opening, a mixture of damp earth and something far older, something ancient. The stranger reached his hand into the dark space beneath the floor. Himmat held his breath, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Safa clutched Himmat's hand, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. The hand came back holding a small, cloth-wrapped object. The stranger placed it carefully on the worn wooden counter. With a sense of reverence, he began to unfold the aged cloth, layer by layer, revealing an object no bigger than a lantern. It was smooth, start, and felt slightly warm to the touch. It didn't seem to reflect the dim light of the store, but rather absorb it, drawing the shadows into itself. Safa leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. It's beautiful. The stranger shook his head gently. Not beautiful, he corrected. Alive. Himmat's eyes narrowed in disbelief. Alive? How can something like that? Before he could finish his question, the relic trembled. A slight but undeniable shudder. A faint hum vibrated through the air. A low thrumming that resonated deep in their chests. The very floorboards beneath their feet shivered as if in recognition of the object's presence. Safa gasped, pulling back slightly. The stranger held the relic carefully in his palms. It has been waiting, he explained, his voice low. Waiting for notice, for acknowledgement. For this moment, the hum grew louder, the sound expanding to fill the silence of the store. It was almost imperceptible at first, like the buzz of a distant insect. But then it began to coalesce, forming words. They weren't in any language Himmat or Safa had ever heard, yet they understood them perfectly. The meaning blooming directly in their minds. Remember, 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 the voice seemed to come from the relic itself, from the floor, from the very air around them. The old store, with its cluttered shelves and dusty corners, seemed to grow taller, wider, deeper, as if space itself were expanding to accommodate the sound and the power it held. Himmat staggered back a step, overwhelmed by the sensory flood. Safa pressed herself against him, her wide eyes fixed on the pulsing object on the counter. This is what wakes, the stranger said softly, his voice a calm anchor in the rising storm of sensation. This is what the village hid. This is the memory itself. The relic trembled again, this time more strongly. Dust motes, disturbed from their long rest on the shelves, began to float in the air, swirling into faint, ghostly shapes in the lamplight. The shadows in the corners bent at strange, impossible angles. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a potent, ancient energy. The stranger looked at them both, his expression unreadable. You have seen it now, he said, and the choice is yours. What choice? Himmat whispered, his voice barely audible above the relic's persistent hum. The stranger's gaze was steady. To let it sleep or to let it speak. Safa tightened her grip on Himmat's hand, a silent signal of shared resolve. Without a moment's hesitation, she looked at the stranger, her chin lifted in defiance of the fear she felt. Speak, she said, her voice firm and clear. As if in response to her command, the relic pulsed with a soft, warm light. The hum deepened, transforming into a soft, rhythmic vibration, a steady beat like a resting heart. And the store, a place that had been quiet and forgotten for decades, seemed to awaken with it. The very wood and dust and shadows stirring with a newfound life. The stranger nodded slowly, a faint smile touching his lips. So be it. Outside, beyond the door of the little shop, the wind stirred. It began as a soft whistle through the empty alleyways, faint but deliberate. The dust in the street shifted, dancing in patterns that hadn't been seen for a generation. A single bird called out from a rooftop and then fell silent as if listening. Down by the coast, the dry riverbed, which had held no water for years, seemed to release a long, collective sigh. The village of Darya, a place lost to time and memory, had been forgotten for decades. But now, it was beginning to remember. The morning after the relic was revealed, Darya village did not wake as usual. The sun rose slowly, weak and pale, as if it, too, was uncertain what it would find. Himmat Ali opened his small store with the same cautious movements he had practiced for years. But the moment his hand touched the wooden door, he felt it, a faint vibration, a subtle warmth that hadn't been there the day before. Inside, the plank under the counter, where he'd hidden the relic, felt warmer than before. Almost alive, he shivered, trying to ignore the low hum that seemed to vibrate up through the floorboards and into his bones. It was a feeling he couldn't name, a disquiet that settled deep in his chest. Safa followed him quietly, her eyes still wide from the events of the previous night. The discovery, the strange man, the secret now shared between them. This morning feels different, she whispered, her voice barely a breath in the still air of the shop. Himmat nodded slowly, his gaze drifting around the familiar, dusty space. He knew she was right. On the surface, the village had not changed. The dust lay in the same forgotten corners. The houses sagged with the same weary resignation. Even the crickets, usually a constant chorus, seemed quieter than usual, as if holding their breath. But the air itself felt different. It felt charged, aware, as if the entire village was listening. The villagers began to stir, moving through their morning routines as they always had, or so it seemed. But small, unsettling oddities were impossible to ignore. Mrs. Harun, a woman whose voice had been raspy with silence for years, hummed a tune she hadn't sung in decades, a forgotten lullaby from her youth. Old, weather-beaten crates in front of the wells shifted slightly on their own, scraping against the dry earth, though no one had touched them. And strangest of all, the dry riverbed, a dusty scar across the landscape, glimmered faintly in the weak morning light, as if it had just remembered the feeling of water flowing over its stones. Himmat was sweeping the dirt path in front of his store when he noticed them. Footprints, but he hadn't seen anyone pass by. They were small, delicate, like a child's, but they followed paths that made no logical sense. Some ended abruptly in the middle of the road, as if their owner had simply vanished into thin air. Others circled the store, once, twice, 3 times, as if inspecting it from every angle. Safa crouched near the strange prints, her brow furrowed. They don't belong to anyone, she said softly, tracing one of the outlines with her finger. I know everyone's shoes in this village. These aren't from here. A cold dread trickled down Himmat's spine. He looked up and down the empty street, the silence suddenly feeling heavy, oppressive. Or something is watching us, he said, his voice low. He felt a prickling on the back of his neck, the unnerving sensation of unseen eyes following his every move. Back inside the relative safety of the store, they prepared tea, hoping the familiar ritual would calm their frayed nerves. But as the water began to heat, the faint whisper returned. It wasn't coming from the floor this time, not from the plank where the relic lay hidden. It seemed to come from the air itself, a disembodied murmur that slithered around them. Remember, watch, remember. Safa's eyes widened, locking with Himmat's. He froze, his hand hovering over the tea kettle. Even the kettle itself seemed to react, trembling slightly on the counter, though no wind blew through the store's broken windows. The sound was everywhere and nowhere at once. It's the relic, Himmat said quietly, the realization dawning on him. It's spreading its memory into the village. He glanced toward the open door. Outside, the villagers were going about their slow, predictable routines. But their eyes, those usually dull, forgetful eyes, were different. They flickered with a new awareness. He saw old man Jamil pause mid-step, his head cocked as if listening to a distant sound. A group of women by the communal tap turned in unison, their gazes fixed on the store. Something was awakening in them, a forgotten knowledge, a shared memory stirring from a long, deep sleep. Later that day, a gnawing curiosity pushed Himmat to act. He decided to check the old well at the edge of the village, the one where the mysterious stranger had appeared. He needed to see if the man had left any other clues behind, anything that could explain what was happening. As he approached the crumbling stone structure, he noticed a shadow moving along its rim. It wasn't the shadow of a person, not an animal. It was just a dark, shifting silhouette that seemed to belong to the well itself. An inky blackness that writhed and twisted against the sun-bleached stone. He took a hesitant step closer, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The shadow lifted slightly, elongating, almost like a hand reaching out from the depths. Himmat froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. And then the voice whispered again, closer this time, more urgent, faint but clear. It remembers, it sees, it waits. The words seemed to echo up from the dark, cold emptiness of the well. A soft footstep sounded behind him. Safa had followed him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was a silent acknowledgement of the fear and wonder that gripped them both. They both knew the village itself was waking up, slowly, carefully, as if reluctant but irresistibly curious. It was a slumbering giant, and they had just prodded it awake. Standing there, with the weak sun casting long shadows over the rooftops, Hemant looked at Safa. The time for caution was over. The time for hiding was past. "We can't wait," he said, his voice firm with a newfound resolve. "If the village is remembering, if the relic is awake, we need to understand it before it understands us." He didn't know what that meant, not really, but he felt it in his gut. They were standing on the edge of something immense and powerful. Safa nodded, her hand finding his and gripping it tightly. She knew what he meant. The relic wasn't just a hidden object anymore. It was a force, a memory, a warning, and it would not remain quiet for much longer. As they walked back to the store, the hum from beneath the floorboards grew stronger. It was no longer a faint vibration, but a steady, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat. It seemed to match the frantic rhythm of their own hearts, creating a strange and unsettling harmony. And with each pulse, the village seemed to shift imperceptibly. A roof tile slid an inch. A loose shutter creaked open. The dust motes dancing in the air seemed to arrange themselves into fleeting patterns. Something was coming. Something that had been asleep for decades, buried under layers of dust and forgetfulness. And it had chosen today to wake. The memory of Daria was returning, and Hemant and Safa were standing right at its epicenter. The quiet was over. The waiting had just begun. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring these tales to life. See you in the next one.